Let's talk about the three main mistakes that I see people making over and over and over again when evaluating translation management systems. Number one mistake, which I consider to be probably the most important mistake, is to look first at process and then at software. What does that mean? Every different software offers certain kinds of challenges and opportunities. There's very rarely going to be a piece of software that's going to be a perfect fit for how processes in any given company is structured, right? The less opinionated a software is, let's say, for instance, think about a spreadsheet, right? In a spreadsheet, you can do absolutely anything. You can create any number of fields, any number of columns, any number of lines. You can create formulas. You can do whatever you want with a spreadsheet, or with any software that emulates the idea of a spreadsheet, right? Even if it's an enriched spreadsheet, it could be infinitely complex, but still the idea of you operating a spreadsheet. And the challenge with a spreadsheet is that it doesn't do that much for you. So it's very flexible, but it doesn't necessarily do that much. Typically, the more aggressive a software is as far as what it can do for you means more things become a little bit more hardwired, which means there are more opinions, more processes that are presupposed in that software. So for instance, think about a ticketing system, right? A ticketing system is going to parse email into tickets. That is a fundamental condition of a ticketing system. That means that the tickets will have different statuses and the tickets can be assigned, reassigned, etc. Now, if you're trying to work with the idea of emails in a ticketing system, you're going to find certain challenges in a ticketing system. Many ticketing systems until recently, for instance, didn't support the idea of CCs. Why? Because CCs aren't really a thing in ticketing systems. The important thing in a ticket is getting it resolved quickly and maximizing customer satisfaction. So the point is, different kinds of software focus on solving different kinds of goals. And it's very common that I see people looking at software as far as how it compares to how they currently do things, as opposed to taking a step back, looking at their overall business goals, forgetting a little bit about process, and looking at what is the best way for me to accomplish that. Maybe you do find a software that's more flexible, but won't necessarily truly get you, for instance, to a certain degree of automation as far as quote preparation or task placement, but it's super flexible, very malleable, amazing. Maybe you're in another software that's a little bit less flexible, but will get you a lot more automation. So what matters, right? What is it respecting your current processes? Is it maximizing your bottom line? In most cases, what I see is most people aren't willing to compromise in how they run things over the software. And in my opinion, that's a very big mistake, because from a strategic perspective, the goal of any company is to maximize its bottom line. And often this approach doesn't lead to that. So that's error number one, in my opinion, is looking first at process, then at software. Error number two is analogous to that error, but slightly different. So for companies that are more mature and already have some kind of software in place, now they're not looking necessarily just at process, now they're looking at software. And there's a typical tendency for people to compare software to software. So I'm in software A, I want to move to software B. I want to make sure that software B checks all the boxes that software A does. And in many cases that approach seems to work, because there's a natural convergence that takes place in most fields where softwares tend to benchmark against each other and consequently converge as far as what they do and what they don't do. Now, if you take software that's slightly different from that pattern of convergence, it becomes a little bit harder to run that evaluation process. And the challenge that you face when you start to compare apples to oranges is that maybe software A has a feature that software B doesn't have. But again, when we talk more abstractly about goals and what you're truly trying to accomplish with the software, maybe you can realize that that thing that seems super important in software A actually maybe wasn't necessarily at all. And maybe software B seemingly doesn't have that, but has a ton of other things that are actually a lot more deterministic as far as shaping your ultimate business outcome. So I think there's this challenge of thinking feature by feature as far as software is thinking about goals and about the ease of accomplishing those goals. And that leads me to the third issue, which in my opinion is also huge, which is the ability to truly experience what any software can offer you. So again, let's think about the spreadsheet, right? I'm not a great spreadsheet user, but I've seen people use spreadsheets in incredible ways. I've seen macros that blew me away. I've seen formulas that I couldn't even begin to understand. I've seen spreadsheets that almost look like they're coming to life with all kinds of permissions and locked cells and hidden references. So there's the spreadsheet and then what you can do with a spreadsheet, right? And software is basically that. You have the software and you have what an expert user can accomplish with that software. And obviously the expert user is bound by what they can change or manage within that given organization. Now, in most cases, what I see is the software, like we discussed previously, the software tends to be retrofitted into an existing process, which I understand makes sense from a non-disturbance perspective. You're not disturbing the current modus operandi in any given business. So you start with this retrofitting process, and instead of leveraging what the software has best to offer, you're leveraging what you can, the bits and pieces here that you can scramble from what the software can offer you. And that approach, in my opinion, it cascades a snowball of continuous effects. Number one, it tends to be hard to truly understand pricing, and more than pricing, the value proposition of that software. Most software is priced very differently, even when they claim to be priced around the same unit. So let's say, for instance, the unit is volume of processed words. Different software can count these words differently. Maybe one software is counting differently quoted words versus non-quoted words. Another software may be counting total words versus target words, or versus the way we count words in ViroWorks using raw processed volume, which is the word count times the workflows and the total number of languages. So there are different metrics for the same component, which can be very confusing. And when you go down this rabbit hole of comparing metrics and components, it gets even more confusing because with several different items like connectors or automation, these are very, very abstract terms that tend to not mean much. So again, a good example is I can claim I have a Salesforce connector, and all my Salesforce connector does is it gets contact a creation in Salesforce and updates it in my software, for instance. Technically, that's a connector. It's an integration between those softwares, but it's a very simple connector. And I can have a connector with Salesforce that's integrating over 200 or 300 different API points and syncing with webhooks and having all this bidirectional communication, super sophisticated stuff. That's also a connector and integration. So it's really important to dig deeper into what the components are, into how they're priced, and most importantly, how they impact your business. It's like buying a car, right? I think one of the mistakes I've definitely done when buying a car is buying a car that seems to be the right car for me versus the car that I actually need for my things. And that's always very confusing because there's a lot of marketing in the mix, and there's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of doubt, which ends up often making it difficult, for me at least, to choose the exact car that is actually the car that I would need given my budget, given my needs, given my goals. So in general, I would say what connects the dots between these three main items, right? Let's just recap. Item one, the tendency to try to retrofit software into processes as opposed to trying to find a perfect balance between software and processes. Number two, the tendency to try to compare different softwares and compare by feature as opposed to by business impact. Number three, we're talking about being able to really understand the finesse of the different components, how they impact cost, and how they impact your specific business. And what connects all of them is, in my opinion, is a certain sense of vision and imagination. So if you're thinking just about the present, and if you're just thinking about a very constrained environment, it becomes very hard to choose the right software for you. Because if you think about it, a software decision should be a decision made, in my opinion at least, especially when we're talking about infrastructure software, like the software we typically see in translation and localization, like translation management systems, should typically be a decision that you're willing to stick with for 5 years. And in 5 years, a lot of things are going to change in your business, in the space, in the software itself. So in my opinion, it's very, very important to choose not something that necessarily fits you today, but something that you believe will continue to fit you moving forward. And I think that's where the imagination comes in play. If you approach software with more open mind, you're likely to be able to find the perfect balance between where you are now and where you want to be as far as processes go, you're likely to find that you're not so much interested in features as you are in business goals and outcomes and how to get there. And you're likely to understand how all these things play out as far as both pricing and value generation. So those are my thoughts on the three main things that people most get wrong when evaluating translation management software. But I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts, your comments? And please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.